Hello and welcome to this edition of The Print Softcover, where we launch non-fiction books. And today's book is interesting because it talks about a topic that's close to my heart, simply because I'm also from the region. It's about Northeast India. It's a collection of essays which are edited. Here's the book. Let's take a look at it. And it's titled But I Am One of You. It has been edited by Samrat Choudhury and Preeti Gill. Hello, both of you, and welcome to The Print Softcover.
Thanks.
Hi,
Um,
lovely to be here.
So, right from the first outset, I think the first question I would like to ask is that between the two of you, what was the discussion like about how many essays you're going to sort of incorporate and the contributors, like how did you zero in on them? And of course, the variety of things that you're going basically the essays talk about in this particular book.
Preeti?
Samrat, you want to go first?
Okay. Well, actually, this book is a continuation of something that we'd already done earlier, which was called Belonging and Unbelonging in Northeast India. And so the conversation, so far as the basic idea goes, is something that happened then when we were thinking about that concept in the first place. And at that time, I remember I was in Bombay and I had been traveling back to Assam because I was working on a book on the Brahmaputra. And so I ended up chatting with Preeti about doing some sort of anthology on this issue of insider outsider, which, of course, I had lived with growing up in Shillong. And once I started traveling extensively in the Northeast, I realized that things that I had left behind many years ago as I went out of the Northeast to study and then to work were still very salient issues back home. And, so that's basically where the thinking about the anthology started, because basically it was to try and get people to talk about this thing which we all from the region know about has existed, but which even among friends we were hesitant to talk about. It was just something that was there but unspoken. And it seemed like something that we ought to talk about in a spirit of friendship and mutual understanding, to try and understand where everybody from various communities was coming from. And so that was the basic thought. And at that time, then, there were a few conversations with Preeti, and ideas got fleshed out. So I think Preeti, can speak more about.
Yeah, I mean, of course, I don't belong there at all. But when I was still working as an editor at Kali for Women and then at Zuban, was when I started to travel there and look for writers. It was also at the same time that I was involved in a lot of projects to do with women and conflict. And I think that was the beginning of traveling, meeting people, and being interested in the kind of stories that were coming out of there. And also the realization that so little was known, because, I mean, it sounds ridiculous to say this, but even now, of the 8 states, people outside are really hard pressed even to say what the capital cities are, and that's correct even today. So it just seemed like, I mean, the fact that I was discovering all these writers, all these people, all these completely unknown, unheard stories. And also, you have to remember that when earlier it was a time of things were not 24/7 on news channels, and there was not this much information outside. So I think that when Samrat and I talked, it also felt like this was something that was necessary to do. It's also that when people write personal essays or memoirs, they sort of add on to what is sort of already in the what you call fact or what is non-fiction, but the fiction or personal essay always seems to add on to that. And that I felt also was something which was extremely important to do, because not only are you taking people's stories, but you're also adding on to the information that's already there and perhaps getting perspectives which otherwise might be neglected. I think both of us felt at that point that though we started in 2017 or something, and then 2 years or so it took to put the volume together, and so much changed in between that. So that is another thing. I think that the region is so volatile and things happen so quickly that it's also important to map all of that. I think that was sort of the beginning, because we really had similar ideas on what we wanted to do.
Okay. So, one of the interesting feature, I'm not obviously trying to homogenize again all the essays, but like you said, like there is an element of the personal, which of course every writer is sort of bringing in, their own lens of looking at a certain political situation or a look or a geographical location or a phenomena which has existed for probably years or even decades before them, before even their own existence. And they also then switch back to what's happening right now, when whatever the right now is, for the author that who's writing. So I've also seen that there's this because we're talking about non-fiction, and then of course there's element of the personal again, even in the non-fiction. Do you think, and this is out of curiosity, do you think this blending of the two, especially when it comes to, I think when you're talking about writings from Northeast, is also very very important, because then I think it also gives voice to the individuality of experience, like what we just spoke before we started the call. I think that the problem with looking at Northeast as 8 states is simply that it's all homogenized. Or even when you go to each state, if you look at the entire state again as a homogeneous entity, it becomes a problem. So I felt this was also a great strategy that way to individualize, yes, yet also looking at the larger picture.
Yeah. Um, well, I mean, so basically, when we did that first volume,
Right,
um, at that time, for whatever reasons, but what ended up happening is that it ended up with a large proportion of writers who were either Assamese or Bengalis,
right.
which was not entirely intended, but it just came out that way because
Hmm.
we were looking firstly for people who were good writers.
Hmm.
Always a consideration when you're trying to commission somebody to write. And also, I mean, there were other factors as well. For example, uh, it was already a time when the NRC was happening, and the only place it was happening was Assam. So, in any case, I mean, looking at the insider outsider issue, we in that first volume ended up with a large number of writers from Assam, the most populous and politically most significant state in the region, and they were large number of them were from either the Assamese or the Bengali communities, which basically means that the tribal states and communities got neglected in that. And we were aware of that, but we were also aware of the diversity of the region and the impossibility of putting it all between the covers of one book. And so it was meant to be an ongoing project in that sense. And so at that time already, before that book came out, already the thought was there that yes, we have to do a second part at some point. And so this is that second part. So this is where we sort of uh, came, and we started with the premise that okay, this is going to be more diverse, and we'll try at least to get in voices from all the states and as
Hmm.
diverse as possible, because of course each state is in some cases feels like a mini India in itself
Right.
because of the sheer diversity. And so therefore, then it was again a question of okay, how much can we fit in, and how well can we fit it in, and the usual consideration when one is trying to commission, which remains that it should be somebody who would be able to write a good piece.
Okay, so one of the things that, and this is because I think around last to last year, I had sort of done a story on how, for example, earlier, one of the other significant things that would often happen academically, if you studied in the region, or even if you came out and wanted to write something, some academic topic, whichever subject stream it could be, it doesn't have to be necessarily humanities, and what inevitably happened is that the accounts that you'd rely on, or the experts that you would rely on, are often not from the region. Actually, there would be a lot of them would be actually outsiders. And when I say outsiders, I don't just mean Indians, it could be across nationalities. And yet, in the last decade at least, with of course establishment of institutes as well, infrastructure has definitely improved in terms of education, I would say. There are a lot more voices from the region, or there are a lot more variety in the voices. People, including people who probably don't no longer stay in the region, have moved abroad or even different parts of India, but they were not using the tried and tested academic tools only for looking at a certain topic. So it was very fascinating when I was doing that story, not just because I'm from the region, like independent of that, I think it was very fascinating because things that I would never have imagined in my own, like, till the time I pursued academics. So I wanted to know if there were things in particular for both of you individually, when you were editing it, that stood out in terms of issues that you may have not known much about, or certain fault lines that you may not have been aware of to a certain degree. So just wanted to know if there were like particular essays which were really, stunning in terms of, okay, this was something that I was completely unaware of.
Preeti?
Yeah, I'm sure um, there are always things that or very vaguely about. You don't really know what's the real situation, or you've just read a little bit about it, but don't really know the complexity or the layers of what's going on. Um, I think I really liked two or three. I mean, not liked. I liked most of them, but in terms of completely new, I think I would say this. There was one which was about the Deshwala's Day, which is about this migrant labor in Nagaland.
Hmm.
Um, I mean, it's not an unusual story because, of course, there are migrant. I mean, belonging to Punjab, I've seen this happening all the time. But it's amazing when you read it from another place. And for me, it became like this kind of mirroring of stuff which happens in other places and which you're also reading about here. So, unlikely as it sounds, this is a story that could well belong to Punjab because there used to be trainloads of workers, migrant labor who would come from places like Bihar and UP in the old days, and they would reach the fields of Punjab for working on the land. And I remember very well in certain households. Relatives where you would visit and they would say, oh, aaj to wo train aane wali hai, and we have to get there and go and see the labor that is arriving. I mean, in a very macabre and ghastly way, it would also remind me of those stories of the slave trade kind of stories that one used to read about in America, in the US. So a lot of the things that or one came across here often felt to me like they were reflections and they were mirrors, reflecting each other. So whether it was things that were happening in the States or things, the same kind of issues which would get picked up in the metros because large communities from those states are living outside of the state. So these were some of the things which really struck me when I was reading the essays.
Well, I mean, I liked also most of the pieces or all of the pieces, which is why they're there in the book. But uh, there were some which sort of, so there's one set of three, right, and right at the beginning of the book, which is
Hmm.
basically three from Manipur.
Yeah.
One by a writer who happens to be Meitei, one by someone who happens to be Kuki, and one by someone who's written about the Meitei Pangal, which is the Meitei Muslim community story,
Right.
reported story. And so reading those three together is actually very interesting,
Hmm.
especially with all that is happening in Manipur now. And the interiority of some of those identities
Hmm.
and the nuances.
One from Sikkim,
Okay.
which was a rather unusual format of a conversation. And for the longest time, I know that we were talking about how this thing would be used. And also, I think Samrat was a little bit tearing out his hair because of how to edit it and make it sort of align it with everything else. But that is rather an unusual piece. It's also a very interesting way of capturing a conversation between two people who know each other so well. One, a so-called outsider because he's Marwari, and though they've lived there for 3, 4, 5 generations, yet how long does it take for you to get accepted? So a lot of the questions that come up in their conversation, which is also very, very, just between two friends. But so I think it's a very interesting piece.
So
Did you
since
get
you
it?
mentioned, yeah, yeah. So since Samrat you mentioned, which is what actually I was coming to eventually, that the first three essays, which were interesting also because of course they are also like literally the first one. So you start reading in a chronological order. As a reader, you start with, of course, the first one, and then you start sort of move. I think I don't journalist probably because even if I have not actively reported on it, with all the reportage coming in for let's say our organization and across that you're reading as somebody, even then there are a lot of surprises that are thrown out even while you're reading stuff about the reportage because here I think here in the three essays what basically for somebody who does not know a lot of or has absolutely no idea about let's say how Manipur itself is constituted, let's say on ethnic and religious and all of these lines, it is like a big surprise because somewhere like I said, it's such a black and white understanding. And even insider outsider narrative is such an interesting bit because I remember going to one of the festivals in Arunachal, which happens, the music festival, the Zero Music Festival, which will happen end of this month. I think even as somebody, of course, the basic history, everybody knows, yeah, till 1972, this was happening, it was a part of some this, all of that. But what you don't go prepared in, I think, is the fact that I think on a railway station, I remember one of the things that stood out for me is that, of course, and that's usual in every railway station you travel to in India, one will be in English, one will be in Hindi. Except you don't expect in a wholly different state, the third line is in Assamese, which is so confusing for me when I was standing there thinking, okay, what just happened, right? Or the fact that I remember after coming from reporting on the side of the road, there was this family who sort of just randomly invited us, sit with us while you buy food. And I don't know, in the middle of conversation, they're like, okay, which state have you come from? And then you say Assam, and they play the most popular Bihu song that you know. And then the woman stands up and does that. And I am just between impressed and confused because okay, what I mean, I literally was that all throughout. I think the internet was so bad that yeah, immediate access of googling to understand how, and then it's only when I got back to Guwahati, I think, that I started reading up. And yet, before, of course, and yet, just before entering, you have to have your inner line permit. So what I'm trying to say and what this essays probably did for me, much as that experience of going to Arunachal did for me, is that the insider outsider, dichotomy throws up something new, I think, every few kilometers, if nothing else. That's the only way I can probably describe it. And how I mean, the Metes and cookies have lived together. I'm not saying in harmony, but they have lived together for so long. And yet, what the rest of the country probably saw is just a burn. And then everybody's like, but what happened, right? We've never heard. I think there's also that which for me, even as a reader, that I wanted to mention that brought out for me is that those interesting layers, those interesting nuances that each of those writers are explaining. And without trying to be condescending, I think one of the things that I personally end up not liking in a lot of academic or slash nonfiction writing is that there is a sense of I know more about this, which often unfortunately comes out. And of course, I'm pretty sure that's also a lot credit to your editing as well. But yeah, I think that is what stood out because it was very um, simultaneously good entry point for somebody who has no idea, but also very, very comprehensive, I think, to a big degree, because there are a lot of examples drawn in from, okay, what happens when you go to Delhi and there's racism of a certain kind, at least in the first one. What happens to racism again when you go to some place like in Australia, where, there's the first layer of racism that you're an Indian or a brown skin, and then, okay, you're from China. That side those, I think, for me was, again, very interesting. So, one of the other things I sort of wanted to talk about, which was, of course, the essay, which is also a very interesting title, which is of Begums and Lailas, which is written by Teresa Rahman. I think I wanted you to tell me a bit about it because, again, it's not just the title. It's just that idea that, again, how, like when you're talking about Nana, I think the Muslim identity is, I think, very interesting to understand, because people don't understand that when you say something like an Assamese Muslim, it is not the same. And it is not, how, that is a very interesting identity. You have, a
Yeah.
whole history of certain cultural artifacts that only belong to them. You can't even, as an Assamese Hindu, ever say, Ki, this is mine. For example, the zikir. So I think that essay, I think, also spoke a lot. So I just wanted, I mean, either of you to probably talk about that.
Yeah, so Teresa's essay, I really liked, and especially as a part of that trio of essays from Manipur.
Right.
And although Teresa herself, of course, is not from Manipur, but the fact that she chose to report it, and it is reportage of a certain kind, because she's
Right.
interviewed these people and sort of written up their story, and it's it is as you mentioned, the uh, sort of a forgotten bit of identity almost, because the Meitei Bengal community has been there for such a long time.
Hmm.
The history of Islam in the Northeast is hardly new. The
Right.
first the first invasions actually happened about 800 years ago, but subsequently there was more peaceful sort of movement as well, right? And so uh, it is you're talking about people who went in there uh, maybe 500 or so years ago at least, and have been a part of that society, and whose story somehow is not known even outside. Within the state, yes, it's known that there is such a community, but in the Northeast, of course, we have our incredible diversity, and of course, uh, people from one state don't know what's happening in the next state, so that sort of barrier between neighbors is also always a thing. And so yeah, so I think I really liked that essay. I liked that piece. And I was just speaking with Teresa a couple of days ago. She said that after the book came out, uh, she got a call from an unknown number,
Hmm.
and it was a Manipuri person, and someone from the Meitei community calling to thank her for writing the piece. Meitei Hindu calling her to thank her for writing the piece and saying that these we don't get these stories.
Right. Similar to how I felt when I was doing that story on, scholarly research and what it means and the kind of topics that are being written about. I think one good sign for me is probably that there are more books. There's more academic exercise. There's more non-literary or even literary exercise. Both in fiction and non-fiction that is being done more. If I compare to, let's say, 5, 10, 15 years ago. And I think we have more variety of voices, not just those five token. Often that also happens. I mean, it happens everywhere. Of course, you have five people who are recognizable. When you say Northeast, okay, five people, we know they'll write for us, and then that's it. I think what's encouraging, I would say, is that you hear so many different voices, newer voices, younger voices, and who are, again, not looking at a certain conflict, even if it's decade old or centuries old, even in the same way as, let's say, the previous generation. I think, honestly, that's like very encouraging. And I think anything related to Northeast, I'm generally curious. I think it's a default. And yeah, like I was really, really excited generally to speak with you and understand more about where you were coming from and what the kind of work that has gone into editing it. So yeah, and so yeah, thank you first for talking to me and also spelling out some of the things that you've gone through in terms of editing it. And yeah, I guess I'm looking forward. Hopefully, there's a third edition of this as well, because I'll really look forward to that, to hear again more voices of it. But yeah, any
Yeah.
closing quotes or thoughts from your end? Would love to know.
Well, I
Yeah, I
think it's
definitely have something. I don't know about Samrat. I
yeah.
said I definitely have something to say.
Yeah,
And
please.
that is, I think I've also spoken to Samrat earlier about this and to other writers from the Northeast including fiction writers. Um, that so many of the stories, I've already said that there seem to be sort of reflections and mirror images of other stuff that's happening in other parts of the country. But I specifically feel like stressing the kind of stuff that one is hearing in Punjab nowadays. And the marginalization, if one can use that word, which one would think of with the northeastern region, with the states over there, a lot of which have boundaries with neighboring countries, not all of whom are friendly. Um, Similar kinds of questions and similar kinds of problems seem to arise on this side also, and on this particular border. And I'm quite amazed because of I mean, having read quite a lot and traveled in the northeast, not to say that I know anything, but I mean, it's not like extraordinary, but the thing is that you can actually see parallels. And I really feel like pointing out to that, because it's also something that has happened in those areas should not happen in other parts of the country, because I don't know why it's like this kind of situation which you keep seeing, including the fact that and I travel to Amritsar a lot. I mean, I'm there every month, so even just going down GT Road, the border still being closed, the border between the capital and a state getting questions. A lot of very unsettling questions that come to mind. And the fact that we've done this thing on insider, outsider, and then saying, but I am one of you. I mean, this is something that can be said in so many other places as well. But I am part of you and I am one of you. So I think to me, that's really the crux of this particular book.
Yeah, for me, I mean, I think that it's important that people should be able to talk to each other in a spirit of friendship about difficult issues. And in the Northeast, because we've grappled for so long, for so many decades, with these questions of who belongs and who does not, and what is to be done about it. And so of course we know people from various communities as friends, as human beings. But then there are the larger political questions where people are reduced to labels and identities. And we've dealt with that for decades. And now that is a problem which is, it's a global problem. I mean, this whole question of stopping immigration, which is roiling the politics of Europe and North America right now, for example. And so these are questions which are global questions. And so even though ours is a small and often forgotten part of the world, but we have experience of decades of encountering these issues and thinking about them. And so I hope that this sort of exercise will actually help people from other places as well to think about these issues in a way that is not directed at atrocity propaganda, saying that people are horrible, but at getting voices from different sides and trying to understand each other. So that is, for me, that is the crux of the matter.
Okay. Again, comments. I think I would probably also think. I mean, something that again I think was on my mind when we especially talk about we should be putting people out and then get very mad when it's happening somewhere else. I think that sort of irony people fail to recognize, I think, is very interesting, and especially something that was also brought up with imposition of a language. Imposition of Assamese also created a lot of problem, as much as earlier, let's say, the imposition of Bengali had created a problem in Assam. So yeah, I think we often probably sometimes need to look inwards as much as we like to look at others and point out the problems, I think. But yeah, again, thank you so much. This is very, very, like, personally, of course, it's very interesting to read more about it. But again, I think it's just lovely as a book to read about, just doing this again because want the viewers to know, and hopefully, more people read uh, the essays that you've collected together.